With AI, we are transforming, and it's happened to all of us. We're becoming, I'm going to call it something akin to smart actors. We're instantaneously experts in areas that we never knew before. And that allows also to transform education in that books are perhaps not written. They're written, at least when you start school, they're written by AIs with a human in the loop. And that's a source of satisfaction and creativity by the students. I think making students feel that they are experts, at least for a few minutes, it can boost their confidence, given the outrageous numbers of students that are
We have to realize that LLMs are basically regurgitation machines, and they repeat things that sort of sound contextually kind of okay, but I think is well known, but as I forecast in the year 2001, they hallucinate a lot. And that is a problem for education. LLMs are going to make a lot of mistakes. To be a really good teacher, what you really need is theory of mind. And LLMs don't really have that. They fake it. They fake everything that they do. That's a problem in terms of education. Where it leads, I think, is not that we should not use them at all, but I think we need controlled studies, and I haven't seen a lot of controlled studies of LLMs. I think we need to stick with the notion that became popular, let's say, in the last decade of evidence-based evidence-based medicine, evidence-based education. We need to do that with LLMs. I haven't seen a lot, and we have to look out for what is the long-term relationship, how many mistakes are they making, what is the consequence of those mistakes. So in principle, this notion of an individualized tutor is incredibly seductive and valuable, and I think we need it.
I've been also involved with the UNESCO in terms of adopting the AI readiness assessment methodology, which starts talking a little bit about the AI and ethics, with taking into consideration the education. But if we look at the assessment itself, it's super abstract. We're doing on, besides providing them with personalizations and all of that. I do believe what we're doing is challenging by itself, because for us, monitoring and evaluation, it's still a challenge. And with the agentic AI and all the trends that's coming, it's going to even become more difficult. And it even becomes more difficult when we start talking about standards.
If you're developing something like ChatGPT, perhaps we could have a law that requires that social scientists and area experts work with the engineers who are designing it to make sure that we try to eliminate particular biases and discrimination that get embedded in the algorithms by the programmer's own biases, right? So we need to make sure that from the bottom and working our way up, that we implement those kind of discussions.
I think it's a mistake to think about, a single set of standards is going to do the job here, especially in consideration that AI is in a constantly and rapidly evolving state. And so I think at one level you do need some a body to talk about some aspirations and safeguards in terms of global societal goals that we all aim for. And maybe UNESCO is the right entity for it, but in terms of a approach like the SDGs, for example. But I think to make this useful and actionable, you really sort of have to think about this as tiers of standards and safeguards that basically engage the people who are going to have to act on them so that they are implementable. There's a whole ecosystem of things that have to build around a set of standards or trainings to be able to really safeguard the practice. And the speaker who talked about the evidence-based, going from evidence-based practice, that's how we have always developed our standards. But I think we're in a different time and place with AI and its rapid development. And I don't know, I think we have to iterate on this as we go forward, because there isn't a lot known right now.
When they implemented the AI grading, the city of Dallas said, well, hold on, we want humans to grade ours, or at least a percentage of them. Scores rose 15% by humans grading them. So essentially what they've already kind of modeled is students need to write in the way that AI can read it, because then that's the only way for them to receive a high score and to graduate from high school. And so there's this back and forth. Now, I don't think that it's technology doing it to humans, but I think that we as human beings write formulaically. AI kind of reproduces that in an even more formulaic way. It spits back at us Mad Libs.
As a result, everybody gets an A, and then you do get an A as well. And I don't think that's going to be the case, right? But because I think there are going to be students who are going to be critical, and they're going to be demanding. There is a large percentage that they demand an education, right? And education is not just giving them A's for free, right? Or maybe what you're implying is that, well, you can hack that by you as a teacher creating the content in AI and assuming they're going to be using AI, and that's going to fulfill the only metric that we have for quality of teaching, which is the surveys that we have at the end of the semester, right? So, is that what you're saying, that we have a broken system of evaluation?
Well,
maybe I'm not criticizing it. If you think about it,
LLMs can influence people's beliefs, and it can do it in subtle ways that they don't know about. There's good research by Moore Naman at Cornell Tech on that. They can incept false beliefs. There's good research by Elizabeth Loftus and others on that. And there were just studies showing that they can impair people's critical thinking because we offload the critical thinking. And maybe that's the one that's actually most relevant here. You have this kind of giant circular feedback system now. Term papers were always terrible, right? Because as a piece of writing, you're writing for somebody who actually already knows the material. It's this very weird sense of audience. It's a weird transaction. But that weird transaction has gotten even worse, and I think the students are basically getting nothing out of it, roughly speaking. They write a prompt, and then they stick the thing in there, and then if they've gotten wise, then they change a couple of words. Somebody posted a tweet. They said, I tried the Marcus method, which is to say I gave out the things to my students, and this tweet went viral because of the results. The person said 63 out of 63 students found hallucinations in the paper that came out. So that was kind of instructive. And then I've also said, as a matter of writing, that almost everything that ChatGPT writes is super bland. And so you can sit with a student and say, well, what would be a more interesting angle? Write the same thing, but make it more engaging. And so I think you can try to make it a teachable moment. But in terms of like the students writing down their evaluations, I don't think they'll do it. There's sort of, one question is like, how could we build individualized tutors for like fifth graders? And that would be a fantastic thing because we don't have enough teachers and we don't have enough engaged teachers and so forth. So in principle, that's a fantastic thing. And then there's what we have right now with AI. And I think the dominant use in AI probably is writing term papers. I mean, more than anything else. Like there were these numbers for ChatGPT's usage, and it like went up through May and then fell down over the summer and then came back up in September. Like that tells you something about how these things are actually being used. I don't think it's a great use right now for education, which is not to say that nobody's doing interesting work. I think some people are, but the predominant use really is LLMs to write term papers. That's not a wonderful thing for society, I don't think.
Yeah. I don't think we as educational institutions are still aware enough how we could apply and deploy AI. We love the term, and I'm coming from the sector, but we still don't know how we could deploy it. That's one thing. So having open AI models is one of the things. It has to be transparent. We have to ensure that it's also audited. I'm not quite sure who should actually audit all the results. We have to ensure how the predictions are coming out. These are some of the challenges we're facing off. And one more aspect, it's who should regulate these vendors? Like, should we have something like the WTO to do so? Should we ensure that we have something like global certification, which says that, yes, this is an AI open model, which we could apply and adopt? So these are things that we have to start thinking about as well. And I think, again, it's moving in a fast pace that we're not even catching up with up until now.
There will be basic tools, basic access, but to make what I see already happening is sort of I hesitate to use democratization of access to AI, but in terms of a non-technical user being able to create some agentic agents for particular purposes, if that is the way that AI really gets disseminated and used in education, is to step back and think about what it is students need to be able to know and do writ large. And maybe writing term papers isn't one of those things, right? And if we're going to create a society with not just digital literacy, but AI literacy, if students are actually going to have to know how to use AI in the workplace, then we need to kind of think differently about the different, what we're asking them to do. What does AI literacy look like? What does AI competency look like? And who's going to teach that? And so we have a whole educational system where, you know, our educators are all experts in their domain, but not experts necessarily in their domain as AI is being used in that domain. And I think this is sort of a sea change for us to do this well. So there's the whole aspect of how to use AI responsibly, ethically, in a way that serves society. But then there's that next level of how do we actually implement this in an educational environment so that we're actually doing good instead of sort of fighting up against the, we want students to do this one thing and they're using AI, so they're not accomplishing any, you know, any learning, any outcomes. Well, maybe we need to rethink what we need those students to learn. And I think that's a whole conversation to be had.
If you go back, a theorist by the name of Michel Aglietta, French theorist or French economist, he talks about the expansion of the means of consumption. Well, we've hit this massive expansion of consumption now where, you know, if we gotten back in the Wayback Machine and went to the 1980s, we spend far more on things like telephones, right? Now everybody has to have their own cell phone service, internet, all these expanding subscriptions that we have. And I think that one place that we're going to end up seeing this is right now ChatGPT is free. And perhaps one way that we could regulate student usage of something like ChatGPT to write their papers is if it actually costs money. Maybe they wouldn't subscribe, or like it's not quite worth it. But what I can see happening, and there are plenty of, you know, we're talking about a limited number of these algorithmic platforms, but there's a expanding number of them, and what I see happening is the segmentation of different platforms from each other, and if you want to do particular activities, then you have to subscribe to it, and then that extra level of economic generation actually starts to impinge on people to even use good tools.
Parenthetical, we should not tell kids to stop learning coding. It's really important that we still have people who know how to code. These systems are not that good. It's easy to get an experience, as Kevin Roos did in the New York Times the other day, where you do some dopey little thing and you think that it works because you don't actually understand. So he had a system that would take a picture of a refrigerator and suggest a recipe. And he got a kind of, it looks good to me reaction, like, oh, that's impressive. If you actually thought it through, there are all kinds of problems. Like, what if one ingredient is in front of another, or you have an opaque container? Things that people who actually code would immediately see, but he didn't see any of it. And he wrote this rave in the New York Times that kind of suggested, we don't need to train our kids to be coders. The Guardian did much better coverage than the Times, had somebody implement, or actually ask 7 people to use the same tools to implement Pac-Man, which is a game from 1982, which is incredibly simple to implement. I could implement it on my watch if I wanted to. And all 7 of the attempts were failures. So even something as simple as Pac-Man is actually outside the range of these no-code things. And in particular, when you learn to code, what you learn is to debug, to figure out what's wrong. And to write good code, you need to write code that can be maintained over time. Having people get this like vague sense that I know how to code because they played with these tools, and then like saying, oh, we shouldn't educate kids in coding anymore, is a huge mistake.
but that it's very, very important to be extremely careful with children's education. The promise of tech in education so far essentially has not delivered. And there was a very interesting report from UNESCO maybe 2 years, a year and a half or so ago, called the EdTech Tragedy, which showed that essentially there was basically no real evidence of improvement or benefits to children's learning from all of the tech that had been rolled out during and since the pandemic. And so I think it's incredibly important to understand that childhood is obviously something that we shouldn't play with, and we shouldn't be experimenting on children. And the use of technology in the classroom has mostly been driven, well, first by emergency, which is understandable, but also by commercial commercial purposes taking advantage of the situation, which again might be understandable, but if it doesn't deliver any benefits to children and to learning, then obviously that should be very carefully considered. Education obviously is a right and it's a public good, and it's really important that the primary role of technology in education should not be about commercialization, so collecting or selling data. This is particularly important now that we're starting to talk about using children's education data also to train AI systems. Now, AI is certainly going to fulfill that potential, we say, and revolutionize education. But this whole talk of personalized learning is also something that we need to be very, very careful about, and make sure that we're doing it on the basis of expertise in learning and in pedagogy, because the way child experts, development experts, and learning experts, what they are telling us is that children do not learn through fully personalized systems, that there might be some very specific benefits in particular for specific children, but generally we don't learn through working in a system which has infinite patience and which everything is prone to be personalized to ourselves. The way human brains learn is through struggle. And so the concept of personalized learning is very different if you talk to an education specialist as compared to if you talk to a tech or AI specialist. So it's just incredibly important that we put children first and we take the expertise in education and put that front and foremost, and not develop technology for education from a tech perspective rather than an education perspective. So we have to be very, very focused on the outcomes, and that probably calls for some caution. At Five Rights Foundation, will be over the coming year working to have a national dialogue in the UK as a pilot project on education technology to build a code for procurement for education technology and tech in schools and in the classroom more broadly. We see that tech is impacting children's brain development. We obviously mustn't supercharge that with AI. It's a price that is not worth paying.
Airlines are probably the best example. We have very good cooperation around what should be safe to fly, and we could do that. What's safe to educate? Whether we can get those agreements in the current political environment is an entirely different question, but I think it would be a good idea. You could put some asterisks around that, so I think different parts of the world do have different requirements.
Adoption of standards is a step, but obviously in and of itself, it's not enough, right? So it is the socialization of those standards and how they have to be adapted. Our little inside joke is that we, right now we're working with 1,300 institutions. There's 1,300 different ways in which those standards are used and applied. And so you have to, kind of have flexibility in there. But it's true that that work to actually take those standards and have all of the faculty and the staff engaging around it and making it work for them. That's where the secret sauce is. I guess it's proof that it can happen, but it doesn't happen universally. And there's plenty of bad online courses out there. And I guess that's the risk for AI too, right? From that model, that for the places where these standards are voluntarily adopted and there's sincere work around them, it moves the needle. Where that doesn't happen, I'm not sure what the role is there for what kind of body is what we need to be able to have those connections, because it isn't like the airline industry where there's it's not a life or death consequence of not doing something right. So it's a really good question, I think.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. The consequences take longer to develop. So, some of it is close to life or death. It's life or death for democracy, but it took a long time to see how bad our education system was in the U.S. such that it would lead to that.
I'm hoping that it's self-regulatory rather than imposing standards, right? Okay, maybe this is too naive to your topic, but it would be great that we don't impose them, but the relationship between the opportunities of work and where the work is provided, the community colleges, colleges and high schools and so on and so forth, that interaction creates the standard for that context, for that community.
But I believe like the governments could work together on maybe having the baselines. Then we have academia and researchers to ensure that the models are actually unbiased, to hold the models accountable. Then we have the civil society, which is very important, I believe, in terms of advocating for all the issues we're going to be having and the gaps. And besides all of that, the industry. The industry are the ones who's actually developing the models. So
I mean, the usual suspects, right? UNESCO and the G20 industry, no question, citywide, statewide, right? Citizens of all sorts, and us also, I think, as teachers, educators, professors, that we live a little bit in an ivory tower. I think it comes to us to not only think, Noah Harari would love me if I say that, but I would involve philosophers as well, but not philosophers, Western philosophers only. I think, the consensus there is in Western philosophy is vastly different from in particular Eastern religions, and people are open-minded and are able to kind of pick up the different underlying behaviors based on these existential conditions, and bring them to the educational loop. I think it's very important as well.
Everybody has a different way, has different epistemology, different way that we know things, and it becomes really high conflict about people who generally maybe politically agree with each other. But you start to get them into trying to regulate what higher education looks like, and it's World War III. So that would be almost a third rail. But I think that there could be common ground around saying, how do we want technologies to interact with education, and what will that look like?
I'll just add one.
I thought it was only the G7 that couldn't take a decision.
No, that's a cultural universal. The balance matters, and what I have seen over and over again watching AI policy is that what you usually wind up with is like 80% industry, 10% well-known government leaders like senators or whatever, and like one civil society person locked in a corner who has no actual power, and the balance is wrong. Marietta Shaka had a great tweet about Chuck Schumer's first AI Insight meeting, and she said it was as if you had a meeting on what to do about the environment, and you had the leaders of Shell and Exxon and blah 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 blah, and one Greenpeace person, sitting in the corner. And so I was just riffing on that, and that is what I have seen over and over and over again. So yes, you had the right composition. Now let's get the balance of that composition right.
Deb?
I mean, UNESCO's been trying for years just to get a global convention on the recognition of qualifications, and there are, many countries that just will never sign on to it. And I think the U.S. is probably one of them, although it has may have more to do with our
lack of attention, lack of basic education, right? So you don't have to go too far, right? So if you solve these problems within country, right, then you can go now between countries as well. Understanding the strength of other countries, and maybe in the U.S. we tend to kind of look at ourselves too much as kind of the golden goose, and and or the opposite, or we think that we're terrible, so we have this kind of bipolar personality, right? So, but in exchange, talking here to people over the world and listening to the ways of educating people and incorporating technology, I'm really very impressed. U.S. being, AI arguably is the strongest right now in the U.S., but the creative use of AI in the classroom in the U.S. perhaps is not up to the standards. So engaging and solving our problems. If we solve our problems at least internally, then we can go externally as well.
I think it's the state of Arizona, and each state in the United States controls its own education. And the state of Arizona, I believe it, they are creating a charter or private school. Charter schools are kind of public. Some entity pays for them and they're free for people to attend, but they're not public schools. It's a crazy system. But they applied for a charter school to use AI to educate the students so that they could spend less time in the classroom and spend more time on job skills. So for me, the whole plan there is to make the students less educated so that they can go out in the working world and be an army of reserve labor that is at a specific or is capable of working on machines in a particular way. And literacy is not the issue. So at that charter school, the students will be spending, I think, 2 to 3 hours on reading, writing, math, and science. And then the rest of the day, they're working on financial literacy or welding or something. And they're not even going to have teachers at these schools. They're going to be coaches because they're not qualified enough. They don't have teacher certification. So what can they do? They can pay the teachers less money, which drives revenue and profit using these machines. So I think the overall goal is actually to lower literacy.
If everybody doesn't already know Cory Doctorow's wonderful word in shitification, that is a good example of the shitification of education.
This concept of a sovereign large language model. So when we've been talking in artificial narrow intelligence in the last session, Norway has invented the using the sovereign large language model, using trusted sources of data from the universities, established media, government records, and for citizens to be able to use that for information. And is it something that there we could see collaboration among education providers so that we know that the data that's going into this LLM is trusted?
I think there's also a political aspect, which is we're giving a lot of power to a small number of companies. We don't really need to, given that everybody is using the same recipe. And a lot of this stuff has been open sourced recently, particularly by China. And so maybe countries should be making sovereign models simply for economic and political independence, not so much because the results are particularly different from one of these models to the next. They kind of all have the same problems, but all have the same utility. But why should you surrender all of your data to OpenAI? Keep some of it in your own nation, and so there are privacy reasons and so forth. So I think there's reason to pursue it, even if the content of the models isn't ultimately that different. But why pay for it when you can get it for free, and why surrender your data when you could have your better policies locally? So I guess I'm more in favor of that than I used to be.
We have all this stuff going on because people are going, whoa, we can't trust the science. And that is the opposite of an educated citizenry. And it's intentional, as Bill Clinton was saying yesterday. And we need to push back against that. So I agree, we need AI literacy. But before we can even get to AI literacy, we need media literacy. We need people that can critically analyze content and say, is this good information or is this bad information? And I don't think we can get to AI literacy until we have media literacy.
I understand why you are an expert, and therefore I can make an informed decision as to how I choose where to put my trust. And so bringing it back around to play in AI, rather that we keep on talking about it at this quite very intellectual knowledge kind of context of education, within an environment whereby you are allowing learners to have control over the application of the design of play or the use of play with AI, depending on what stage they're learning they're at, that gives you not only an understanding of what you're capable of, what it's capable of, how it is created, and then that further down the line means that you are creating citizens, people who understand what it is.
That there was efficiencies gained by using various sophisticated technologies, but they were very protective of what is a legislated nurse-to-patient ratio that currently exists, because their concern is this will be used as a justification to diminish or to alter that ratio and require greater efficiency from nurses through offloading tasks to AI. Now, I think that that is one way to think about education as well, that you shouldn't be offloading work onto machines so that you can reduce the human component, because socialization is an important component of education, and facilitating that collaboration with experts, whatever teachers, experts in education, is critical. In the end, what happens though is that with the decline of unionisation, I mean, potentially there, well, in the US at least, kind of occupational health and safety that might be the vehicle through which you could have this discussion. There is a problem or a lacuna in terms of engaging those stakeholders in the process. Like with very low rates of unionisation, what is the other vehicle to bring in workers who are workers in these fields that deliver these services for the public at large to ensure that voice is heard? Is there an alternative to that vision of union involvement or organised workplace involvement or OH&S kind of understandings of how to incorporate this technology in a safe way, in a very granular, practical manner?
It's largely, we're a working class, first generation student university. We're a Hispanic serving institution. And many students, all they want is to get that degree. They don't actually want to do the work. So that's why, right, well, what's the effect if students actually feel like you're shortchanging them? Well, they want me to shortchange them. The more I push back and try to force them to learn, that's when my ratings go down, because I was too hard.
You know, in another stage, there is much more support and much more tools for communication. I communicate with the students one by one. If a student doesn't come to class, I write him an email, and then we have a communication. So we have this capacity now to do these things.